This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Joe Lynham, and in the early hours of Sunday, the 21st of March, these are the main stories. Demonstrations against coronavirus restrictions have taken place across Europe as lockdowns are reintroduced ahead of a feared third wave. 11 people have been charged in Malta with offences linked to the murder of the investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. No overseas spectators will be allowed to watch this summer's Tokyo Olympics because of the virus. Also in this podcast,
one thing we don't realize, we tend to think happiness is this big overriding thing that you can achieve. But a better metaphor for happiness is that it's like a leaky tire. Every once in a while you got to pump it up full of air.
What does it really mean to be happy? And where are the happiest places to live? Find out later. Tens of thousands of protesters have taken to the streets in Germany, Britain and other European countries to demand the end of the coronavirus restrictions. But governments in many countries are seeking to tighten, not ease, lockdowns as the numbers of deaths and cases rise. The largest demonstration was in Kassel in Germany, where Chancellor Angela Merkel is considering reimposing a lockdown. The protest highlights a growing weariness with the restrictions. For more on the mood in Germany, I spoke to our reporter in Berlin, Damien McGuinness.
The people we have in Kassel who've been demonstrating are quite representative of quite an extreme part of the national debate right now in Germany. And the people there are a real mix. Some of them don't really think this is a real pandemic. Definitely some members of the far right were also there. You can tell that by the signs they were holding up. Some people who just don't like this government in general, the same sorts of people we might have seen on anti-migrant protests beforehand. Or we've had other groups of people in these protests. This is the largest one we've had really this year. But we see these protests every week really in various different cities. And it's such a varied mix of people who don't agree with this lockdown or the government's policy in general. It's hard to characterise them. But I think when we're looking at Germany as a whole, what we're seeing really is a growing dissatisfaction of how the government's handling it. And that's really more to do with the vaccination campaign, because the numbers are going up right now and the numbers of vaccines are not going up. That's the real problem.
And indeed, Germany was praised 6 months ago for containing the virus better than other big countries, notably Britain. And the death toll is not as high, but the vaccination campaign is a mess.
Yeah, it's been really difficult. What's been interesting, Joe, is that last year Germany was really seen as a model of how to deal with the pandemic. Hospitals were well prepared. They managed well with the rising cases. Angela Merkel's government provided strong leadership, and most people agreed with how Germany had dealt with things. This year, though, since the rollout of the vaccine, there has been a lot of dissatisfaction. Numbers have really shot up. The death toll has risen quite remarkably over the past 6 months. And the problem right now is that infection numbers are going up while the government is loosening restrictions. And that's why it would be wrong to say that people are dissatisfied with the lockdown in general, because a lot of people are saying, actually, we need more restrictive measures because the numbers are going up. And I think this general feeling of dissatisfaction on both extremes of the debate are what we're seeing in Kassel, but also it's coming through in the political debate and really falling polling numbers also for Angela Merkel's Conservative Party and for the other Social Democrats who are also in government right now.
Damien McGuinness in Germany. There were also protests in Spain and the Netherlands, as well as discontent in France and Poland. Thousands marched through central London as well in a demonstration police said was larger than expected. Our correspondent John Donnison sent this report from the midst of Saturday's protests in Trafalgar Square.
To the beat of a drum and with some chanting freedom, thousands of tightly packed anti-lockdown protesters marched up Whitehall and down the Mall. One man carried a placard bearing the words, "No more government lies." Very few demonstrators were wearing masks and there was no attempt at social distancing. So far, the police, who are out in numbers, have been taking a hands-off approach. Deputy Assistant Commissioner Lawrence Taylor said mass arrests were not practical.
They are committing an offence by gathering in these numbers. Equally, if we've got several thousand people walking through London, to arrest every single one would require several thousand police officers. And at the moment, that would be very challenging. We are making arrests, we are enforcing it, and we are doing that in a proportionate way.
Among the crowd, there are some conspiracy theorists and COVID deniers, with some accusing the mainstream media of pushing fake news. But that's by no means everyone here. One woman who didn't want to be named told me she knew COVID-19 was bad, saying, "I had it myself last March, but this lockdown is too much."
John Donison in central London. Chile has recorded its highest daily number of new coronavirus infections, the latest South American country to be swamped by a resurgence of COVID-19. Almost all hospital beds in the country are occupied, and the capital, Santiago, has been placed into lockdown this weekend. Chile has one of the most advanced vaccination campaigns in the world. By some reckonings, it stands third behind Israel and the United Arab Emirates. But officials say the arrival of more contagious variants of the virus and a relaxation of some restrictions has led to a rise in cases. Staying with COVID-19 and to Brazil now, as the rate of deaths from the coronavirus continues to rise, partly through the highly transmissible local variant. Brazil's hospitals have been overloaded to breaking point. In some states, there are no intensive care beds available at all, while the ICU wards in many others are almost full. Amid the chaos, President Jair Bolsonaro fired his health minister, who is an army general, and appointed the fourth health minister since the pandemic began. Our Latin America correspondent Will Grant reports.
In cities across Brazil, protesters wearing the green and gold of the Brazilian flag took to the streets over their government's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. But even with the country's entire hospital system on the brink of collapse, they weren't protesting against President Jair Bolsonaro or his dismissive attitude towards the virus. Rather, the defiantly maskless men and women were his supporters, angry at the lockdowns imposed by their local governors in Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro and beyond. Around the time those who oppose closing schools and businesses were exercising their right to gather, 52-year-old petrol pump attendant Antonio Colin was fighting for every breath. In a hospital in Sumaré, in the state of Sao Paulo, he exchanged voice messages with his daughter Jessica as she desperately paced the corridors trying to track him down. "After I finish the tests, I'm going to be hospitalized," he tells her. It was the last time they spoke. His death has been especially hard on Jessica. The doctors told her that her father would die without an ICU bed, but that none was available. She lodged an appeal with a local judge in order that he be admitted to the ICU.
The injunction came out 2 days after I made the request. It said that the state had 48 hours to find a hospital bed for my father. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough time. The deadline expired on Sunday, and that was the day he died.
Stories like Antonio's are happening every day in every state in Brazil. The desperate situation is overwhelming the country's healthcare system and shows little sign of easing up. While other nations appear to be finally turning a corner with the pandemic, Brazil recently registered its worst day yet in COVID-19 related deaths. Hundreds of kilometres away from Sumaré, where Antonio died, is Florianópolis in the state of Santa Catarina.
Right now, I have no beds left. If someone dies, I have already another one waiting in line.
Dr. Israel Maya is an intensive care doctor in Florianópolis who specialises in respiratory disease. The picture he paints of the situation in his hospital is bleak.
We have people intubated outside of the ICU. This is not good, because the doctors that will treat those patients, they are not intensive care doctors, so the surveillance of the nurses, surveillance of the doctors are completely different.
The overloading of the system has been bad enough, says Dr. Maya, but the problems are exacerbated by the more aggressive variants of the virus circulating unchecked in Brazil.
In the state where I live, we have already 65% of the virus, they are variants. We don't know which of the variants from Manaus, from South Africa, or even from UK. However, the variants are much more transmissible.
As President Bolsonaro has steadfastly downplayed the threat from coronavirus, even recently told people to stop whining, he may now be facing a political reckoning.